A new infrastructure for decision-making was integrated into daily life. It presented itself as a neutral improvement to routine. The effects were not immediate, but cumulative. This was not an isolated change, but the first sign of a different pattern. By the mid-1990s, the average person encountered roughly 3,000 commercial messages per day. By 2007, that number had doubled. Today, it approaches 10,000. But the change wasn't just volume. It was the conversion of environments, physical, digital, social, into systems optimized for a specific outcome, the reduction of conscious selection. Supermarkets began reorganizing based on eye-tracking studies and purchase interval data. Digital interfaces adopted variable reward schedules borrowed from behavioral psychology labs. Social platforms engineered their timelines around engagement metrics that prioritized reflex over reflection. Each system, taken individually, seemed innocuous. Together, they formed something else entirely. The language used to describe these changes was careful. Personalization, convenience, seamless experience. These terms framed the elimination of friction as progress, and in many cases it was. Reducing unnecessary effort is not inherently manipulative, but the systems being built weren't just reducing effort, they were eliminating the pause between impulse and action, the cognitive gap where choice actually occurs. Most people didn't question it. The changes arrived as improvements to things that already existed. Grocery stores had always arranged products strategically. Advertisements had always tried to be persuasive. Restaurants had always designed menus. What changed was the precision. What changed was the scale. What changed was the underlying model of what a person is, from someone who decides to someone who responds. This wasn't discussed openly. There were no public forums on whether defaulting people into subscriptions was ethically distinct from offering subscriptions. No widespread debate about whether interfaces should be designed to maximize engagement time or to serve user-defined goals. The technical communities building these systems had their own conversations, sometimes concerned, often excited about what was now possible. But those conversations remained largely internal, conducted in the language of optimization and conversion rates. The assumption embedded in most of these systems was straightforward. People don't actually want to choose. Choice is cognitively expensive. It creates anxiety. It requires information and time. If you can predict what someone will want and simply provide it, better yet, if you can shape what they want so it aligns with what you're providing, you've solved a problem. You've made life easier. And in many cases, this was true. People did report feeling relieved when decisions were made for them. Recommendation algorithms saved time. Autoplay removed the burden of deciding what to watch next. Pre-filled forms eliminated repetitive data entry. The benefits were real and immediate. What arrived more slowly was the recognition of what accumulates when small decisions are consistently outsourced. Not a single catastrophic loss, but a gradual redistribution of authority. Habits that used to form through repeated conscious choice began forming through repeated exposure. Preferences that used to develop through exploration began developing through algorithmic curation. The real impact appeared years later, not in any medical sense, but in patterns of behavior that became difficult to explain otherwise. People who couldn't articulate why they bought certain brands, only that they just always had. Adults who realized they'd been using the same few apps for years without ever consciously deciding to continue. Families whose weekly routines were shaped more by default settings than by discussion. By the time these patterns became visible, they were embedded. The infrastructure supporting them had matured. Entire industries had organized around the assumption that behavior could be predicted and guided more efficiently than it could be chosen. Backing out would require not just individual effort, but systemic redesign. And the systems kept refining. Machine learning didn't just predict behavior, it began shaping the options presented in the first place, creating feedback loops where predictions became self-fulfilling. A person searches for something once, and the algorithm begins serving related content, which the person clicks because it's there, which strengthens the algorithm's model of that person's interests, which generates more of the same content, until the original search becomes a defining characteristic of their digital profile. None of this required conspiracy. It required only the different systems, built by different people, all optimized toward the same underlying metric, reducing the gap between stimulus and response. Faster conversions, higher engagement, lower abandonment rates. Each optimization made sense within its own context. Together, they constructed an environment where the default path was always the path of least resistance, and the path of least resistance was always the one that benefited the system's designer. The language of choice remained. Technically, options still existed, but options presented in a particular order, with particular visual weight, in particular contexts after particular priming, don't function as neutral selections. They function as guided pathways. The architecture of choice had become a method of directing traffic. What made this especially difficult to resist was that it didn't feel like manipulation. It felt like efficiency. The systems were good at what they did. Recommendations were often accurate. Defaults were often reasonable. The problem wasn't that the systems failed. It was that they succeeded at converting decision-making into a service that could be provided, measured, and monetized. Children growing up inside these systems developed different baseline expectations about how choosing works. For many, the default mode became present options, select from what's offered. The older model, identify need, research possibilities, evaluate trade-offs, decide, began to seem unnecessarily complicated. Why go through all that when you could just see what's recommended? The shift was generational, but not limited to the young. Older adults also adapted, often without realizing the extent. Retirement planning, which used to involve significant research and personal reflection, increasingly became answer a questionnaire, receive a portfolio. Political information, which used to require seeking out multiple sources, became open your feed, read what appears. Even healthcare decisions, once the domain of extended conversation with trusted physicians, began migrating toward enter symptoms, view suggestions. This pattern didn't stop there. It expanded into physical spaces. Stores began removing price tags, replacing them with digital displays that could adjust in real time based on demand algorithms. Restaurants shifted toward QR code menus that tracked what you looked at and for how long. Cars introduced subscription-based features where capabilities you'd already paid for could be remotely enabled or disabled. The message wasn't subtle. Ownership increasingly meant access to a service, and services could be modified without your input. Even language evolved to accommodate this. Curated became a positive descriptor. Frictionless became an aspiration. Smart came to mean makes decisions for you. The word choice itself began appearing more often in marketing than in descriptions of actual decision-making processes. It became an aesthetic, a feeling rather than a practice. For a moment, consider what you reached for this morning without thinking about it. The question isn't whether these systems provided value. Many did. The question is whether the value they provided came with an unexamined cost, not in privacy or data, though those mattered too, but in the slow transfer of decisional capacity from individuals to systems designed to predict and guide them. And whether over time, that transfer changed not just what people chose, but their ability to understand choosing as something they do, rather than something that happens to them. Similar decisions followed.